Today's lecture is about the transition in New England between the 1630s and the 1780s. And in that transition, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the transformation from Puritan to Yankee. That's something I mentioned when we talked about the Great Awakening, but it's something I want to look in more detail now. The social transformations that take place over those 150 years that I think produce a different society. And the other thing we're going to be looking at is how the American Revolution comes into this, because the last of the three New England towns we'll be looking at today, Charlotte, Vermont, is a post-revolutionary place. It's not founded until 1784, and the Revolutionary Wars ended. So by looking at these places, I think we're going to be able to see some very real differences in the New England of the Puritans and the New England of the Revolution. So let's start out with Dedham, Massachusetts, which was founded in 1636. And Dedham's a classic Puritan town. There it is. Dedham is just southwest of Boston. It borders Boston. It's one of the first towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded beside Boston, and it's a classic Puritan small town. Here's another look. This is of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and there's Dedham, just on the southwest border of Boston. And Dedham used to contain a much larger landmass than it does now. In 1636, when it was first founded, Dedham encompasses Westwood, which is on this map. It also encompassed a whole number of other towns. It was probably 6 or 7 times larger than it is today. And here's the Fairbanks House in Dedham, Massachusetts. This is the oldest structure in British North America. And in the center there is the original structure. The building's been added onto over the generations, but this is an intact Puritan home, and therefore an important building in American architectural history. In any case, we should imagine this as what the Puritan settlement in Dedham was like. And here is the first church in Dedham, Massachusetts, just like the first church in New Haven we looked at before. This is where in 1638 the first Puritans, as soon as they've settled in town, build themselves a meeting house. And they built later structures on the same spot as the original one. So that building there was built in 1761, but it's on the spot of the original 1638 meeting house. So very typical New England village, and Dedham still looks that way in big sections. So what do we want to talk about when we talk about Dedham? Well, the historians of Dedham has claimed that Dedham was what he called a closed corporate community. And this is what he meant by that. Dedham is founded by a small number of families, a handful of families, fewer than 50, who sign a contract. And then they go to the Massachusetts General Court, that is the Massachusetts legislature, and they request a charter for the town, which they got. So the small number of families come together as a corporate body. They have joined together before they even approach the legislature, and they are also the core of the church. They are granted this town from the legislature. They come to Dedham. They subdivide the land. They begin farming. They build themselves the meeting house, and they, for many years, conduct themselves as a tightly knit community, both in terms of politics and in terms of being Puritans. That life in Dedham remains that way for a couple of generations. I want to talk about how they divided the land. They divided the land on the basis of 3 criteria. Very interesting, I think. First was on the rank, they called it, And that was how important you were, what status you had in society, what your family background was. And this goes back to what your rank had been in England. So they have a very hierarchical sense. We've talked about this with the Puritans before. Very hierarchical sense of who's important and who isn't. And you're pretty much born that way. And that determines how much and what the quality of the land you obtain is. The second criterion they used was family size, which is one I think is very obvious. The bigger the family you have, the greater your needs will be for farmland. And third was what they called usefulness. And usefulness was, I think, a concept we're all familiar with. If you're involved in any kind of small organization, any kind of club, any sports team, any kind of service organization, a church, you know who can be relied on to show up. You know who the hardcore people who are going to be doing all the work is. You know the people who are going to be there every time. You know the people who are serious about the commitment. And that's what usefulness is. And it's an informal category, but I think when you think of it in those terms, everybody understands what it is. And I think there's a kind of consensus about who's useful and who isn't. If you ask people in an organization who are the leaders of the organization, who are the hardest workers, who's always showing up, you're going to get the same names over and over. So this is a kind of indication of the tightness of the village life they had, that they knew each other intimately, and they subdivided the land based on that. And Dedham continues on in that vein for quite some time. It's not until 60 years or so later that significant changes begin to accrue in Dedham, and we'll get back to them later. But now I want to talk about Deerfield for a little bit, because Deerfield is going to illustrate what's happening in Dedham. Deerfield was founded in 1671, and Deerfield's useful to us because it's founded as a colony of Dedhams. There's Dedham, there's Deerfield. So what happens? What happens is that Dedham, by 1671, is starting to be a little bit crowded. Now, significant chunks of land in Dedham haven't been distributed yet, so you'd figure, well, there's more land to be distributed, but that's not what happens. In the 1650s, the town closes itself. The men in town sign a charter, and what that charter says is that only their descendants will be eligible for subdivided land. So when new families come into town, they are not eligible. They may buy somebody's farm, but they are not eligible for further distributions of land within the town. And that means there are some people closed out from the growth of Dedham, or certainly their children are. So by 1671, there's a group of these people who don't really have expectations left in Dedham anymore. They want to move further west to the frontier, and Deerfield's on the Connecticut River, and it's very much frontier in 1671. And they get a charter from the legislature just as the founders of Dedham had in 1636, and they move together to Deerfield. So Deerfield is in fact a colony of Dedham's in 1671, and it's founded very, very much like Dedham was. Okay, let's talk about what goes on in Deerfield a little bit. We've seen this before. I remember I told you about the Deerfield massacre in a previous lecture. Deerfield is attacked and burnt during King Philip's War, and it's abandoned in 1675 when King Philip's War is going badly for the Puritans. Shortly after the war, it's reoccupied. It's very much a frontier settlement, as you can imagine from this. And then it's attacked again by the French and Indians in 1704, the Deerfield Massacre. So Deerfield is way out there in terms of Puritan Massachusetts. It's kind of a dangerous place. There's nothing between the French and Deerfield except woods. And it remains this kind of western edge of settlement for a while. So that's one thing about Deerfield. Here's a house in Deerfield. You can see that it's a little more substantial than the Fairbanks house. Maybe slightly more elaborate, if you look at the chimney, for example. But not that different. It's essentially, the same Puritan architecture of that we're going to find in Dedham. Another house in Deerfield. This is the Williams house, where the family that was attacked in 1704 lived. Okay, now let's talk about land distribution, because this is really getting to the heart of our discussion. This is Deerfield, and the bottom right of this is Deerfield Village, and you can see Deerfield Village has one main road going through it, and then it's been divided into small house lots that are numbered. Now, behind Deerfield Village, we see the land distributed in long, thin strips that go all the way to the river. This is an old English pattern of land distribution, and very similar to the one that had first been used in Dedham. And here's the village again, with the houses along it, and you can see the lots behind each house, and then farmland all the way to the river. And that farmland was subdivided into those strips and farmed communally. Let's go to this image. Okay, this is a painting of a harvest in England in 1725, but it's a painting of this kind of communal agriculture that was being used in Massachusetts in the 1600s and in probably really not much into the 1700s. This old English style of agricultural use. The land is subdivided into strips, but those strips are not farmed individually like in this image. They're farmed communally. So the way Dedham worked was the land was subdivided into individual lots, but it was farmed communally at first. And the decisions were made communally. Are we going to hay today? Are we going to chop wood today? Are we going to try to clear a field? Are we going to plant today? All of those farming decisions were made communally. Over time, however, about the time Deerfield started, in fact, those decisions are ceasing to be made communally in Dedham. People are beginning to farm their lots individually, and they're making individual decisions about how to spend their time and when to plant and harvest and so forth. They're also beginning to consolidate their land away from those strips that we saw previously into individual farms. Now, this is a process in Dedham that takes a couple of generations to happen. People begin trading some of those strips to each other. They begin to try to consolidate their lands. They buy and sell lands as generations pass, as people die, as people move into town and move out of town. And this is a process that there's no plan for, but slowly, over the course of 3 or 4 generations, they move away from the strip agriculture to individual farm holdings, as we conceive of farms. And that implies a couple of other things. One, people begin building barns on these farms to hold the harvest. And as they begin working on their fields more and more away from the village, the walk to and from the village seems to be more wasteful, and they begin building houses next to their barns. And the result is a scattered farm landscape like we see in New England today, rather than the compact village and everybody farming the land surrounding it as they had in England. So slowly land use patterns change, and this land use pattern we just saw on this map of Deerfield doesn't last terribly long either. It reverts to this, what we think of the New England standard, pretty quickly. That implies some more things. It implies that the village ceases to be the center of life for some of the farmers who were farther out. And that's why Dedham begins to break up into more and more villages. People in Westwood, Massachusetts, for example, I showed you Westwood on the map next to Dedham. Westwood, they eventually petition the legislature to allow them to build a new church that's closer to these guys who are farther out, and they eventually get allowed to do that, and then the political division follows kind of inevitably, though it takes a while for that to happen in Dedham. Another thing that happens is you begin to get political divisions in town. The people who are farther out, the people in the village begin to have different interests, about, say, village improvement. And the politics in the town changes. The politics of Dedham early on are the politics of consensus. The select board's the leading men in town, and they pretty much tell the town what to do. But 100 years later, town meetings tend to be more contentious. There's real politics involved. So that changes as well. So land use patterns, social organization, politics, religion, all evolve over the course of several generations after the founding of these different New England towns. I'm going to go back one slide. This is one we've seen already, and this shows the pattern of settlement in 1700, where eastern Massachusetts, the shore of New Hampshire up to Maine, and the Connecticut River Valley are the two major settlements of the Puritans. And then on the lower right of this image, something we haven't talked about before, this is Wethersfield, Connecticut, and you can see the same pattern of strip development there. That's how these New England villages start, and they do it because it's an English pattern. And like we said before, the Puritans just transport English life to America. But what these maps don't tell us is that this changes over the course of a few generations, and with those changes come all these other changes that I've just been discussing.